So hello, thanks for having me, and I'm quite honored, and I understand the privilege that I have to be here for a number of years, the past SWIBs. So besides this talk, I just want to let you know that because of that privilege, I do want to be available to you as much as the time allows. So please do approach me in private, or if you like to have a lightning session or something where we can all benefit from, as everyone else mentioned about why we have these meetings. So let me know if you want an elaboration on some of the things that I'm discussing, or if you have something in your mind in the workspace that you're in, and perhaps get something, whatever I can offer or serve as part of the day-to-day work that I do. So yeah, please approach me. I'm not just here for the talk, and it's not work hours either. So it could be over dinner or breakfast or whatever you want. So again, thanks for having me. As usual, I'm quite religious about this. My slides are online on my website. They're machine readable, so it's in linked data. It's an RDFA. It's human readable. I've been working on this for advancing this type of thing over the years. It integrates one of the applications here. I'll show you in a moment. It just kind of all comes together, and in the past I talked about that. I think I came here in 2015. That was the first time the SWIB organizers were kind enough to invite me to talk about this linked research stuff, and I dropped the idea of what solid is around that time. I was visiting researcher at MIT and Decentralized Information Group with Tim Berners-Lee to work on solid. So I dropped the idea there, and then came back, gave a workshop on Dokali to actually talk about solid, to communicate the underlying ideas about solid using an application, which is this little thing here. This talk is not about that. I've been using that tool a way to communicate the underlying ideas. And I'm happy to see that others have picked up on solid in this community and elsewhere, and reintroduced it or developed it further to make sure that more people understand what that whole thing is about. It's just an idea or a project just like any other, so it's not like a bulletproof thing, and it solves everything. I mean, the whole idea is to fix the web, quote unquote. It's quite ambitious, given where we are at. And I can tell you where all the dead skeletons are, of course. But so anyway, that's just a little bit of context of how I've been around this community, or how much I appreciate actually the work that you do, because I've said this in the past, it's quite applied, it's visible, and seeing that I'm not particularly in the libraries community myself, so it's nice to see how active and understanding this community is to pick up these ideas from everywhere and apply and put them together in a way that actually serves the society. So I'm quite impressed by that, as always. So slides are right up. Groups, I'm involved in an ocean of internet or web standards bodies. I chair the Solid Community Group. I've been in social web working group and so on. I am leading the lead editor or author of the Solid protocol and a bunch of other specs and whatever. So I'm quite familiar with these specs. So again, if you have really detailed questions, do approach me. It's not just about the presentation. That said, this topic that the kind of things I'm about to discuss in a moment are, in a way, I know all the bits and pieces that are there, but trying to communicate that in a way that's coherent, I found it to be quite complex, put together. So it's, in a way, quite new to me. So bear with me if I'm making some mistakes, but the details are something I can elaborate on, as I said. CC license. Bye. Okay, so let's start with some eye candy. So like I said, this is the slide, and this is the graph of the slideshow. I won't get into details. We can figure out what's happening. I use this as a gimmick sometimes to communicate the underlying ideas. And just for example, this slideshow is talking about, if you can see that, but it's talking about the solid protocol specification. And if I click that, it goes and fetches that thing. And that document happens to be linked data as well in RDFA. And each requirement, each concept, each significant unit of information is also expressed in RDF statements and for whatnot. And this is useful for all sorts of stuff. You can point at a single specific requirement and say, this test is about that requirement, or that requirement is perhaps developing or deriving something else from another requirement elsewhere on the web. Anyway, it's a gimmick. It's fun, but this is one tiny, small aspect of what this application is. It's not about that. I just want to kind of show you how some of these ideas, like, we're writing a specification, but we're able to have a view of that specification. We can filter that specification if it's machine readable. And believe me, I do have to make the argument, even in my own groups, that we should eat our own dog food and have these specifications machine readable. So it takes a lot of energy still, even to the group that I'm with. And it starts with showing examples and repeating these examples. And I think this is something that the library community does all the time, showing things that are working and trying to make the argument over and over and over until it gets there. So pardon for the long way of starting this whole thing. Talk is generally about autonomy, I think, and universal access. This is really high-level concepts of the things that I'm talking about here. We do want individuals to have their own agency on the web and off the web, of course, and the web is a kind of a reflection of society. So what kind of tools and technologies or do we need to devise that are ethically grounded so that it enables our autonomy on the web? It needs to be accessible. I don't need to preach to the choir about universal access, of course, but the underlying concepts are, I think, kind of go along these lines in this talk. I'm going to make a bunch of quotes, and bear with me, because if you cannot read it, I find that if I can read this for you, it's more accessible to everybody. So there's a concept of self-publishing, and it tells that an actor or an agent can register identifiers for their content, shape and store data where they have access to, set access controls, and use preferred applications to achieve them. So that's a version of what I consider to be self-publishing. Again, there's some links there you can follow through if you want to look up later. And I start with that because a lot of the things, it's not just about, an actor doesn't have to be an individual, it could be a community, right? And I'll get to the degree of control in a moment. So web is a social machine. It's not just an engineering work there. It has a social effect. It was designed to have a social effect, and is a social machine. The problems that we have in society are on the web. It's amplified, perhaps, and it comes back to us and shapes our society. So, again, how we devise the technologies and the way we approach these standards and so forth, in a way, helps us move society forward. So it's just a tool, just as the print, the movable type, and so on. Those things were in the past 500 years ago, and it took probably more than 35 years before the print revolution actually took off. It wasn't in the 30 years. So if you can imagine, we're about, 35 years mark or something right now, maybe a little bit more. I forget the count now. It's really early at this, we're at the early stages of the web. We don't really know what web or after web or internet, considering AI and virtual realities and so forth, like how that will look like in 100 years, right? But when we look back at the print, it has revolutionized society, right? It's changed, reorganized, reconfigured society. We needed bookshelves. People had a reason to read, right? It was simpler or cheaper to get a hold of knowledge because it was have multiple copies distributed and so on. This is, again, preaching to the choir, but I'm just trying to give the context of the print with the web here. And this is a quote about RDF, in fact, and anyone being technically allowed to say anything about anything. But I don't try not to communicate that in terms of RDF, but just generally that this is really what we have on the web. And that's good news, and that is also the bad news, because, well, anyone can say anything. So we need to figure out what kind of standards and tools and environments, social web spaces or social spaces that we want to enable that balances perhaps the freedom of speech with, I guess, our the cultural norms and so on. So I'll talk a little bit about this notion of degree of control, and this is slightly based off the architecture of the World Wide Web. What I did was I took off the key components, and they tend to touch the identification and interaction and formats. But when we think about centralized, decentralized, it's not. It's really vague sometimes. Like what kind of decentralization do you mean? Is it technical or organizational and so on? One way of looking at it in the context of the architecture for World Wide Web is, well, it's a spectrum. So you may have, like an actor may have full control over the identifiers that they want to assign for their resources. They can, pick that each character in that URI, or maybe a third party will be doing it. So it's a spectrum, or to what extent? Maybe portions of that URI you can, and other parts of that you can't. Some paths you can't. Same goes for data. Can you shape the data? Can you express your own profile in a way that you see fit? Can you does a tool enable you to enter your pronouns in your profile, right? So that is something to consider. Like, do I have full control over it? Does an individual or a community have control over whatever the property is about anything? It doesn't have to be about a person either. Or is it a third party that dictates the user interface or the things how you can express something? Same, again, the third is about applications. Do I use an application that's given to me to interact with all this data? Or can I write my own application without changing anything on the underlying the data that it uses or the identifiers? Is it decoupled, right? That's the architecture of the web, getting at the idea of decoupling or orthogonal specification so that the identifiers can be evolving independently from the specifications from data formats and from the interaction formats and so on. So again, think of that as more of a spectrum, not just like either or, but like some services, some tools may enable you, give you more autonomy or agency about like what you can do with that, and different various aspects of it, others less. So you can think of a service or a tool that you're building and think, well, can anyone pick the identifier they want in that space? Or data shape their data and so on. So I'm dropping like some random ideas here to build the whole thing because it's really scattered, and the web is all these notions are really scattered. It's not like one coherent idea following linear ideas. It's just they're linked. So I'm quoting LDN, the linked data notifications here, because the thing that we wrote there was, in fact, we were wearing the solid cap there to explain what solid is, but this is about linked data notifications, but it has a lot of influence from the solid perspective. So I'll read that as well. Data on the web should not be locked in to particular systems or be only readable by applications which created it. Users should be free to switch between applications and share data between them. And again, if you go back to this, you can see, like, am I locked into that application without changing the data? And these are the underpinnings of solid in a way. So, and the solid, this is for those that may not be familiar, I'll give that to you as well, what the solid project is. And the aims of the project is to, with the web itself, so empowerment towards an equitable, informed, and interconnected society. And this is from the Ethical Web Principles published at W3C, the quote here. And the subquote, and equitable, informed, and interconnected society. Solid adds to existing web standards, so it's not trying to redesign everything. There's a lot of standards that we try to reuse or we need to bridge with and so on. Where it's trying to realize a space where individuals can maintain their autonomy, again, control their data and privacy, and choose applications and services to fulfill their needs. So it's there's a lot of similarities here about the concept, right? Again, there's solid project assert. I'm going to shift towards a bit like the history here, but you know, this Fediverse stuff is nothing new. In my past life and a lot of others, we've been, since when the social web thing became more prominent in perhaps mid or late 2000s, I suppose, like 2007, 8, 9, 10, so on. We had standards that we were trying to work out, like these things around this project called StatusNet, which one of the things, flagship sites was Identica, perhaps you're familiar with it. And in StatusNet, so this is, in fact, in StatusNet, we published each profile was a FOF. Like there's a FOF representation of the profile, and made sure to get that on the LOD cloud back then. So it's been staring at us all this time that there's a huge chunk of, this data is old. I know that the stuff in the LOD cloud just sort of gets staled and all that stuff, but it was there, and I'll talk about how the standards evolved, but it's been there. So it is linked, it's been staring. That's just a one, you know, giant portion of the cloud, or significant enough that it's in the legend, so to say the least. And I'm mentioning, this is based on StatusNet or Status back then, but that gave way to the standards in a way that's more agreed or discussed in a standards bodies, right? So back then when we were developing OStatus and StatusNet platform, it wasn't a standard. It was, I mean, there's a bunch of standards, of course, communities come to it, but it wasn't like a standard from a specifications that are approved by a standards body, like IETF or W3C. So that stuff came later, and that was because of the prior work, to the incubated work, or you know, that made the case for it, so that we can have standards actually capture that stuff. I thought about various titles for this slide. I went from comparing apples and oranges, because I think sometimes when I read online what people think of solid protocol or ActivityPub, I find it both insightful or strange. So I just want to make sure that it's not an either or thing, and it never really is with the standards unless it's literal, they're taking the same use cases and trying to come up with a different set of requirements or solutions. Then we can say those are comparable. But in some of these cases, it's not, because when you dive into the specifications, you can get a feel of what kind of classes of products that this specification will enable. Again, you know that the graph I showed you about the requirements? Well, that kind of tells you what kind of a spec it is. Is it a you know, is that specification telling you to build a server, like whatever that server is? Is it an authorization server, resource server? Is it a notification server? Whatever. Like, it's not just a server either. There's nuance, and you have to look into the details there. And it may be a client or some other notion that's mentioned in the specification as to, if you implement this part of the specification and you have, you know, and we expect perhaps and something that needs to be interoperable with this other class of products. So generally, we say it's like one of the generalizations may be client server or server to server, right? But don't hang on to these terms too tight, because when you look closer, you can see that sometimes there's overlap between these concepts across these specific standards, but you can see where they may actually be connecting, or there's a gap and we need to look closer. So I won't like try to walk through all these details. I know that there's, you know, we have to work with a fixed time here. So there's just basically the aspects of what solid protocol tries to do, or ActivityPub. again, ActivityPub was the later version of OStatus and activity streams and so on. And linked data notification sort of comes in, LDN comes into the picture with sort of addressing both of those things, or it comes before ActivityPub, in fact. And ActivityPub uses it. So generally speaking, ActivityPub is, or it's comprises what we normally refer to the Fediverse. So when you look at the Fediverse, you look at the details, it seems to be mostly about ActivityPub. That's what I'm talking about, ActivityPub, not this notion of Fediverse, but so these are the specifications that I can concretely make some sense of what they are, what they're not. So ActivityPub is generally about like social activities, and a quote-unquote social. This is the social web, that basically the context being social web. You write short messages about where you are, or what you did, what you relate with, and so on. And there's a conversation and discourse, as you know. So that's the context of ActivityPub. Whereas Solid is more generic. It's domain agnostic. So it could be about any data. You have a storage. You can put your personal data. And that could, it's not just about it could be about your social activities, but it could also be just your health data. That's not really social data, right? And you may need to give restricted access to the people that only they can, or communities or groups or organizations, only they need to get access to a portion of that data. So the problem space is quite different. That's why I say, why not both? Because, well, you could extend a Solid server to implement the server parts of ActivityPub. Then basically, if the user posts a notification or creates uses a client, an application to send a message or creates an activity of some sort, that the client is doing the part that it needs to do. Once it hits the server can do all sorts of stuff. Well, if you want to do federation, you implement the server-to-server parts of the specification. That's what that is. And LDN is one of those things where it uses for messaging. So I won't dive too far, but ActivityPub again covers some aspects of the protocol. Like, it doesn't really tell you what authentication mechanisms you should use, right? Solid there's an error there. It's not OID, it's OIDC. Pardon me. But so there was overlap, or there's at least a way to extend an implementation of the specs to do these things. So I'll fly through this as well. The containers, there's a lot of these concepts, just rinse and repeat. Notion of container, or notion of storage, or inbox and outbox. It's like this idea of containers and collections. Maybe they're ordered collections. What happens? What's the expected behavior when you send a notification to an inbox, and or when you put an object into an outbox? But they have shared understanding. So it's like, for example, inbox is initially was a way of building off the notion of a container of an LDP. Not overly restricted to it, but it's really influenced by it. It's, after all, it's even the properties in the LDP spec. But right, so storage is also a container. The storage is a space of URIs. There's a root container of a storage and so on. So the ideas are shared. I want to be clear about the difference between compatibility and interoperability, because it's quite important. Proprietary solutions tend to don't scale that well. They're good, or it's feasible to come up with things that can communicate, a set of or fixed products that can perhaps communicate with one another, but we don't call that interop. That could become de facto interop later on, but it's not. Interop is more to, when you say interop, it really means it at some point it touches on standards. So I want to be clear about, like, you can have two products or two implementations unless they are adhering to a common standard. What's that is just really some patching work that, or some fixed understanding of how these two specific products can work. And if this one product changes, then the other one needs to update itself to adapt to the other one. Whereas interop, you have a common ground on how, what the rules are. It's upfront. And you can develop something today with the standards, and if another implementation builds something 5 years or 10 years from now, adhering to the same standard, we expect those things to interop, those things to work together against each other. Just like take a web browser, right? If you want to build a web browser today and you adhere to the HTTP protocol, it's probably going to work with most servers out there, or most common servers out there, right? And that's like perhaps 30, 35, whatever years, I mean, depending on which spec you're talking about, but down the road, right? So there's a different view of what interop is from there than just patching up two different implementations. Am I doing okay on time? I have no idea. So I'm just talking. Okay, all right. I will try to go quick. So standards are like wine, not mine. Friend, colleague Henry Story in our standards community, some of you may aware of, said standards are like, he used to tell me this, some will age well and others spoil. So kind of hang in there, things change all the time, and standard may be super popular today, but maybe it won't be picked up in 5 years from now, or maybe some other social problems or technical challenges come forward and we need a new standard, or we need to patch it up and so on. So it's a moving thing. HTTP is not fixed. It's 0.9, 1.1, 2.0, 3, whatever. So it's moving. And yet some of them move slower than the others, but depending how important they are, but it's not a fixed thing. And we learn by implementations and whether they're actually solving social problems. I'm going to skip a lot of the things around how the principles, these things are linked, so you can follow that, but whether the principles we have are following some process, or what entails consensus, right, or unanimous consensus, and so on. How do you deal with it in the standards bodies? How transparent are they, like decision making about how something should work? Is that minuted? Is that accessible? Like, can we look up how people decided why a certain protocol was behaving this way? Like, can we go back in time and follow the provenance record and so on? This is important as far as what we consider as open standards development, right? Because anyone can say, oh, I just wrote a standard, I wrote a specification that does this, but is it coming from an open community? Is it an open discussion and decision making and so on? So there's a way of sort of differentiating, where standards sort of fall, how they process. And each standards body may have slightly different ways of approaching this, but they do. There are common principles. I think it's from the open definition, open stand. I think there's a link here. You can look up. Again, there's this code. Decisions aren't made by those who show up, but when we say this as a kind of, well, standards are made by those that show up. It's not just some mathematical proof that we do or anybody can do, and we have a standard. It's really just, it's a social thing. You have a need, you show up, you convince the other, and I can say this because I'm in this space. If you convince the 3 people or the 20 people in that room or in a group, you have a standard. It may be great, it may not be good, it may need to change, but that's really how it is. And again, so it's a privilege to be there, and we ought to use that privilege for common good, because not everybody can show up and either understand the technicalities of it or be able to make our good arguments or convince. And you need to deal with the people in these spaces. It's always coming down to social problems. It's not technical problems. And in that space, we have this not invented here syndrome, or we have the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's all there. So people are coming there with their own agendas. and make the case for how something should work, because they have their needs. They want their products, their solutions to be heard, and the use cases to be picked up, and so that standards solve their problems. But again, to get to interop, we need to hear from a wider group, and cover the use cases as up to a point where we can, that's sensible to incorporate into the thing. It is social and technical, so it's not just to be clear. I'm going to skip over this because this is very in-depth. But again, you can follow up this perhaps a commentary or recommendation about the notions of centralization, decentralization, and how these standards bodies can perhaps improve things. We need to think about social implications of, again, I really superficially touched this, but it's just, I think it comes down to whether the things that we're building are ethically grounded. Is it enabling the user to have a positive effect or solving their problems? And are we having a healthy outcome from this, from these solutions? Like, are the specifications building helping society move forward? Are we is that causing problems? So you can build something, and if you don't consider how harassment, for example, may be addressed, well, that opens up a whole space of, the specifications may not be addressing it, and implementations of those specifications may not be addressing it. And then you have a service, whether I won't name the services that you're probably thinking of as I'm telling you this, but how do they approach discourse in the public space? And is it a custom solution? Like, is that one company's or one product's opinion about how to address this discourse, or is it a common understanding where it works across the web? Because that is really important. If we don't cover that gap or clarify how that works, well, we have a mess of misinformation or disinformation that just amplifies from there, right? Again, about identities and profiles are like you can have conferences on this topic. So, but it's various factors and variables and circumstances in which we have to consider how we express ourselves. Again, autonomy, tying to the concept of autonomy, and this degree of control and so on. Who can say what and how they can use their profiles, how you can refer to their profiles. Or cognitive characteristics, whether you can express that in your profile. Again, this is something around general ideas of just some aspects of the social space or a scholarly space where you have some annotations and notifications, some resources that you want to talk about, and there's individuals. With a few standards here, you can achieve this, and this is not hypothetical, this is already done. This is based off LDP or LDN or ActivityPub and so on. You can do these things today. Web annotation, right? This is the other one. Switching, just to cover the scientific communication aspect. So there's this article, and you may be familiar with it already anyway, but the scientific community has been kind of latching on this for a long time, and I think it's great as well. It's easy to communicate these ideas, but again, whether some solution is addressing registration or awareness or certification, archiving, are like you can pick up different specifications or different things that actually address those problems. So they're decoupled. So it doesn't mean, so if you have a solution, how do I say this? Can I participate? Can I in the scholarly discourse by registering my own? I have my own identity, web ID, or identity on the web. Can I self-publish my own articles? Or while I self-publish, can others review my work? So what tends to happen in scholarly spaces that we get this packaged deal, right? you need to use this third-party publisher most of the time to make your communicate, right? And that will say, well, you need to certification of what constitutes a peer-reviewed article can only happen in this space, right? But those are separate functions. Like the notion of being able to publish something is completely different than the reviewing or approving in a community or certifying it or acknowledging it or is a separate matter. Just because I put something on my website doesn't make it true, right? And this is where the other things. Oh, okay. I think we're good. There's an ocean of web standards or internet standards. It's just there's a lot of stuff there. This is just not even the tip of the iceberg. What I'm listing here. There's just some of the things that I think this community is aware of or have come across, and we can reuse these things. And the reason I mentioned the forces functions is because, well, if you do have a problem or something that you want to solve, you can dissect this in a way where you say, okay, the thing I want to enable is my community to be able to send notifications about the articles that they've published. Well, if you separate it, you can look at the specifications. Does that specification enable, like, have some aspect of it covering the idea of awareness, right? So if I said, if I picked a random specification, it may cover awareness, it may not. So linked data platform, for example, which everybody's, I assume most people are familiar with at this point in time, is not, it's generally, this is, generally intended to cover registration and awareness functions, right? It's not meant for certification. Like, you can put something in an LTP store, but it has no sense of certification or archiving there. It's just you do a HTTP request, you put it somewhere in a container. You may give, if it's a HTTP put, with an HTTP put, the client can indicate what the URI should be. Again, the degree of control, like, is that server enabling me to create my own identifier? And can I use it for the general purpose of awareness? Can I, send notifications from that or distribute that information and so on? I'll wrap it up with this. What role could libraries play here? I think a lot, because you can start with sharing your use cases. And anyone can get involved in these. Again, it's a privilege. Let's not forget that. But the door is generally open to step in. You may need to navigate, if you're not familiar with it, the space, the cultures in these groups. But it's important to put your use case out there and stand your ground about this is significant. We have standards, or there are gaps in standards, or lack of standards, or there's problems in standards, and you can get that across. And this is a way of, like, you can propose solutions as well, because maybe you have worked on it, and you can review others' solutions. There are patterns that you've noticed in the library space. You can share from your implementation experience, because that's incubated work. That's really important. You can say, yeah, we tried that like 5 years ago. Don't go there. We don't need a standard for it. It's just a dead end. This is, like, super valuable, because sometimes standards folks to do architecture, astronomy is what we say, right? Like, they're just writing some specs perhaps, but if it's not tied to actual use cases, like, sometimes we detach that, but if it's not taking implementation experience into account, then it's just a specification. You may get stamp of approval from your peers, or the group may get stamp of approval from the peers, or even get a recommendation from the standards body. But again, this whole thing about that spec may die off in 5 years. It may not survive down the line. So there's a lot that goes into, like, this implementation experience. And you can, I don't want to, this is not my place to say it, but you could, consider what you could host or store for good. And I want to know what you think about it. Or you can also tell me where I went wrong with some of the stuff. So I think that's the end of it. So thank you for your time. and happy to, talk to you longer.
Microphone?
Oh, right. I'm sorry.
Okay, I think we have, because we started a little late, I think we have time for, let's say, 2 comments, but please also, as Sarven said, please continue the discussion throughout the day. But does anybody have a question or comment? There's one. You can use this one.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that. That was awesome. The question I have is going to give you the opportunity to recover one of the skipped slides, because you said something about considering carefully the question of extensibility. And there it is. And I was really curious to hear more about that.
Oh, yeah. So specifications can generally come with, the rules of how things should behave or what you need to do to have this interoperability and so on. But okay, there's a topic, and it's a huge topic itself, but like good specifications it's hard to do this. It's more of an art than science, but like good specifications leave some, in my opinion, variability in there where different kinds of solutions can happen. I don't mean to diverge and fork off, but slight variations in some of the things it does because of these minor use cases that are needed. So specification can tell you a range of things that it should really require to do, and then some things may be a little bit touch vague or touch open so that it allows room for it to grow. And this is really important because that's a way of, it's a hook to get new feedback from the implementation or wider implementations on what's actually working, because sometimes people need to do things that are custom to their communities and so on. So the variability, there's a whole specification in W3C about variability and specifications. I can share that with you later, but it's quite important. And the extensibility kind of ties into that, where specifications can also include ways of perhaps building off or extending the core data model or core interaction, where it tells you the rules so that different communities or different solutions can come in the future from different times, but still generally agree to the same rules. So how do I say it? I'll give you some examples. Like open digital rights language is one data model or information model that tells you, well, as the name implies, kind of policies and whatnot, and that you can express. And it also has a way of saying like what kind of actions is prohibited or permitted. It gives you a fixed list of actions. Like it could say, this action prohibits you from archiving it or distributing it or reading it or playing it or paying for it or something. But that's just a list of things that the community, that group that showed up, decided that this seems to be useful for the group or for most people, because they took in the use cases, but that might not have taken all the use cases into account. So if it has a model in the specific that tells you how to extend that further, but while still playing by the same rules, other people can introduce new terms or new actions or concepts that still ties into it so that it can be reusable by a wider group. I hope that kind of gives you a feel of what this is, something that the standards bodies needs to consider, because it helps to save costs on just only developing one spec, and then next year building something completely different or a new spec, because it's just that didn't cover the use cases that you want, right, in the first spec. So instead of coming up with like a whole new spec around it, write down the rules for how the extensions can be enabled by again, decentralized like just like vocabularies, right? Like we have the RDF data model that allows, there's a bunch of rules around it or expectations. I can just publish my own vocabulary on my own web space as long as I agree to some of the concepts like URIs and RDF or this and that, and how that would work. And I don't need to go through a central authority to say, can I publish it? Because there's some, that's just one example, but of how that works, right? Because separate bodies can publish their own vocabularies in their own space. They don't need to ask it. So you can do the same thing if the specs are good, if they have enough. Again, variability is important, and extension model and so on. So this is saying that the standards body should take that into account. Long answer, maybe.
Yeah,
but
thank you.
Okay.
That was a very long answer, which is why I think we will move the rest of the discussion to the coffee break. And
okay.
thank you again, Sarven, very much.